On January 28, 1986, the world watched in horror as the Space Shuttle Challenger tore apart just 73 seconds into its flight. 7 astronauts lost their lives that cold Florida morning. But here's what most people don't know. For weeks after the disaster, NASA remained eerily quiet about one crucial detail. A detail that would haunt the families, the engineers, and eventually, the entire nation. The question wasn't just what happened to the Challenger, but when did the crew die? Was it instantly in that fireball we all saw on TV, or was the truth far more disturbing? Today, we're diving into one of NASA's most closely guarded secrets, a secret they desperately tried to keep buried. This is the story of what really happened to the Challenger crew and why NASA chose silence over the immediate truth. Let's get into it. You remember where you were when the Challenger exploded, right? It's one of those moments frozen in time, like 9/11's. Millions of us, especially kids, were glued to our TVs on that January day in 1986. We were all there for Krista McAuliffe, the high school teacher about to become the first teacher in space. NASA had made this mission a huge public event, a symbol of a bright future. And then, just 73 seconds after liftoff, it all turned into a national nightmare. We all saw it, the shuttle, climbing beautifully, suddenly engulfed in a massive cloud. That horrifying Y-shaped plume of smoke against the blue sky is an image none of us will ever forget. The 2 rocket boosters spiraled away like broken fireworks. The immediate thought, the universal assumption, was that the 7 astronauts died instantly in a massive explosion. It seemed so obvious, but that's not what happened. In the hours and days that followed, NASA officials were very careful with their words. They spoke of a tragedy and a loss, but they avoided one specific word: explosion. Why? Because they already knew a secret, a far more disturbing truth they weren't ready to share with a grieving nation. Here's where the story takes a dark turn. The Challenger didn't actually explode in the way we think of an explosion. What we saw was what engineers call a structural breakup. The external fuel tank ruptured, creating that massive fireball, and immense aerodynamic forces ripped the shuttle apart. Okay, you might be thinking, so what? An explosion, a breakup, what's the difference? The crew still died. Yes, they did. But the real horror is in the asterisk, how asterisk and the asterisk when asterisk. Days after the disaster, salvage crews began pulling wreckage from the Atlantic, and they found something that sent a chill through NASA: the crew cabin. It was mangled, but it was largely intact. You see, the crew compartment was the most heavily reinforced part of the entire orbiter, designed specifically to protect the astronauts. When the shuttle disintegrated at 46,000 feet, the cabin didn't blow up, it didn't burn. It separated from the wreckage and it began to fall. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, that cabin, with 7 astronauts inside, plummeted nearly 9 miles towards the ocean. Let that sink in. 2 minutes and 45 seconds, that's an eternity. It's long enough to listen to an entire song. It's an unimaginable length of time when you're falling from the edge of space, knowing what's coming. This is the part of the story that was hidden for so long. When investigators finally examined the recovered crew cabin, they found something that confirmed their worst fears. Evidence that at least some of the crew had been alive and conscious after the breakup. How did they know? They found the personal egress air packs, or PEAPs. These were the astronauts' personal emergency oxygen supplies. Of the packs they recovered, 3 had been manually activated. You don't accidentally switch these on. It's a deliberate action. In the middle of that violent, tumbling chaos, Commander Dick Scabee, pilot Michael Smith, and mission specialist Judith Resnick had all reached for and turned on their emergency air. It was a conscious act. They were fighting to survive. But here's the cruelest twist. The PEAPs were designed to help in case of cabin depressurization or toxic fumes on the launch pad. They couldn't save them from this. The air packs offered no protection from the catastrophic impact with the ocean at over 200 miles per hour. The official report from Dr. Joseph Kerwin, the astronaut who led the medical investigation, stated that the findings were inconclusive, a carefully worded phrase. It meant they couldn't prove consciousness until impact, but the activated air packs told a story they couldn't ignore. The astronauts were likely alive, aware, and completely helpless for every second of that 2.5-minute fall. The story we were told was a tragedy. So why did NASA stay quiet about all this? It's a tough question, but let's try to put ourselves in their shoes for just a moment. You're in the middle of managing the absolute worst disaster in the history of your organization. Congressional hearings are on the books. The media is relentless, circling like sharks. Families are shattered with grief. The entire country is traumatized. Now, can you imagine having to turn to those families and say, by the way, your loved ones were likely conscious and fully aware for nearly 3 minutes as they fell back to Earth? It was an impossible choice for NASA. Do you tell the complete, horrifying truth and inflict unimaginable psychological torture on the grieving families, or do you say nothing? NASA chose to focus on the technical failures. They talked about the O-rings, the cold weather, the engineering decisions. They let the world believe that the end was instantaneous. The official line was clear. The O-rings in the right solid rocket booster had failed because of the unusually cold temperatures that morning. Hot gases escaped, burned through the external fuel tank, and that led to the structural breakup. All of this was true, but it was an incomplete picture. For months, NASA released information slowly, very carefully. The recovery of the crew cabin wasn't something that was widely publicized. The activation of the emergency air packs was buried deep in technical reports that very few people would ever read. When reporters asked directly about the crew's fate, NASA officials used carefully chosen phrases. They'd say things like, "We believe the crew lost consciousness rapidly and the impact was not survivable." Again, both statements were technically true, but they were deliberately dancing around that horrifying middle part, the minutes between the explosion and the impact. Eventually, though, the full truth started to trickle out. Persistent journalists dug through those dense technical reports. Experts began to analyze the evidence more closely, and the families, understandably, demanded more complete answers. NASA was finally forced to confront the very thing they had been trying to avoid. They had sent astronauts into space in a vehicle that, if anything went wrong during launch, offered them absolutely zero chance of survival, not even a theoretical one. This devastating realization completely transformed the space program. When NASA began designing the next generation of spacecraft, they incorporated something that was truly revolutionary for the shuttle era: escape systems. The space shuttle had no escape mechanism during the launch phase. You were strapped in, and you either made it to orbit or you didn't. It's interesting because the earlier Apollo program actually had a launch escape system that could pull the crew capsule away from a failing rocket. But for the shuttle, nothing. NASA had deemed it unnecessary, believing the shuttle was so incredibly safe that it would never fail. The Challenger disaster proved that assumption was fatally wrong. Look at today's spacecraft. Like SpaceX's Crew Dragon and Boeing's Starliner, they all have sophisticated abort systems. At any point during the launch, if something goes catastrophic, the crew capsule can separate from the rocket and parachute to safety. This is a direct life-saving legacy of the Challenger disaster. NASA also completely redesigned the solid rocket boosters, implemented strict new temperature restrictions for launches, and fundamentally changed its entire decision-making process. No longer could engineers' safety concerns be overruled by managers who were just eager to meet a launch schedule. So, the very disaster that NASA tried to softly bury with silence ended up sparking a revolution in human spaceflight safety, ensuring that future crews would have a fighting chance. So why did NASA stay silent about what really happened to the Challenger crew? The answer is complicated and deeply human. They were trying to protect grieving families from an even more painful truth. They were trying to protect their own reputation. They were trying to preserve public faith in the space program during its darkest hour. Were they right to do so? That's for you to decide. What we do know is this: the 7 astronauts aboard Challenger, Dick Scabee, Michael Smith, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe, died in service of exploration and discovery. They were heroes before the disaster, and they remain heroes today. Their deaths were not in vain. Every single safety system, every abort capability, every temperature restriction that exists in modern spaceflight exists because of them. NASA's silence may have been well-intentioned, but the truth ultimately forced them to build a safer future. A future where astronauts have a fighting chance if something goes horribly wrong. The Challenger disaster taught us that transparency, even when it's painful, is absolutely essential. Those critical engineering concerns must never ever be ignored for the sake of a schedule or politics, and that the truth, however difficult, is always better than comfortable lies. 73 seconds. That's all it took to change everything about how humanity approaches space travel. And perhaps that's the real legacy of Challenger, not the silence. But what happened when the silence finally ended? What do you think? Should NASA have been more transparent right away? Or was their approach understandable given the circumstances? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden stories behind history's biggest moments, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Trust me, we're just getting started. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.